It is a pleasure to join Janice and welcome you to this, our 29th program. We have offered at least one every week since April 22nd, and more than 4,000 registrants per program has been our average over the past 3 months. Our list of co-sponsors grows every week. Temple Isaiah, Stephen S. Wise, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck, ECAR, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, and the Holocaust Museum LA, and our newest sponsor this week, the Pico Union Project. We are thrilled at the audience we have acquired and proud that we have presented honest discussions on difficult issues and help expose how out of the ordinary the past 3.5 years of Trumpism and their apologists have been. With very smart speakers, Republicans and Democrats, we have helped shed some light and bring some sanity to a challenging time. If we have helped our viewers learn about issues and assuage some frayed nerves by virtue of smart talk from smart people, we have been successful. Please enjoy today's program. It promises to be terrific. Now, my wonderful partner, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, with whom I have worked these past nearly 4 years. It has been a joy. She's a remarkable leader. Janice?
Thank you so much, David. I cannot resist a moment of reflection. We, that is Jews United, in partnership with community advocates, started this series on September 26, 2017, a little more than 3 years ago, in an effort to stave off the normalization of the many threats we felt that this administration posed to our democratic norms and ideals. It was frightening to see the repeated assaults on constitutional protections and the incessant violation of our standards of decency and civility. So we organized these programs to stay mobilized, informed, and to be in community in protesting the threats to our democracy. As an aside, on a personal level, working with David Lehrer, Zev Yaroslavsky, and Mel Levine each week on these programs has been a joy, as has been working with the other two members of our leadership team, Rabbi Ken Chazen and Caroline Kelly. I also want to give a special thank you to Jeff Hensiek, who helps us each week with our Zoom connections. As a Jewish organization, and now I speak for Jews United for Democracy and Justice, our motivation was to speak out against the threats we perceived both as patriotic Americans and from a place of Torah and Jewish values. We felt that both value systems meant we had to vocally object to and roundly reject the lack of humanity which we were witnessing and to affirm our commitment to fight for our democracy. In spring of this year with COVID, we adapted our programs to Zoom with lots of people at home, with lots of free time on their hands. We went weekly, and with it, our audience grew exponentially. I too want to echo David's words about our gratitude to our audience and to our many stellar speakers. We have worked hard to bring to you the best and the brightest. We are nonpartisan, but make no mistake about it, we do have a bias, and we have had one from the outset. We are not simply a speakers bureau here to entertain you with these amazing programs. Our mission was and continues to be to keep you mobilized, to encourage you to keep speaking up and speaking out against actions which go against our values. Our bias is in favor of preservation of our democracy. Whoever thought that would be something under assault by a sitting president? I know there are people on this call of many different faiths, but in Judaism, we have a prayer which I believe is universalistic, a prayer we say when we have arrived at a special moment which we have long anticipated, the Shehechianu. Through this prayer, we express gratitude for having been kept alive and safe so that we could arrive at this special day. That is how I feel about this election day. Like so many of you, I thought it would never come, but here it is, and I am grateful. Now, to further introduce our panelists, please welcome my friend, Judge Leadership Team member, Professor, Bruin, and great LA civic leader, Zev Yaroslavsky.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you, David, for the great work you've done over all these years, and especially the last several months in keeping us all informed. And Mel, thank you for your partnership as well on this. I'm going to be very brief in my introduction. I just want to say one thing to the audience. I assume that everybody here has voted or knows exactly how they're going to vote, when they're going to vote. And that's really critical wherever in the country you are. And we have a national as well as an international audience. So please be mindful of the election. I'm sure that's not necessary. We have an all-star panel tonight, and I'm really looking forward to this. So let me get to the introductions. Several of them you've heard from before if you've been following us. Lynn Vavreck is the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA in the Department of Political Science. And she is the author of two important books, The Upshot. She contributes to The Upshot at the New York Times, and the author of Identity Crisis, which is a book on the 2016 election, as well as The Gamble, a definitive work on the 2012 election. Max Boot, who is no stranger to our screens, is a historian, best-selling author, and foreign policy analyst who's been called one of the world's leading authorities on armed conflict. He is a columnist for the Washington Post and a global affairs analyst for CNN. Jennifer Rubin, also no stranger to our screen, an opinion columnist covering politics and policy, foreign and domestic education, and writes for the Washington Post. And she has been an incredible contributor to us on multiple occasions. A newcomer to our screen is Paul Maslin. He's no newcomer to me, a good friend and a colleague. Paul is one of the leading public opinion analysts and campaign strategists in the country, and has been so for more than 3 decades. He has done a lot of my polling, continues to work with me on those things, and is engaged in a number of races, including the race of Senator Jones in Alabama as we speak. And finally, our moderator tonight, who did such a great job a few weeks ago, we brought him back, and we're really delighted to have Bob Shrum, who I've known for 40 years. Bob is the chair in practical politics at the UNRWA Institute at USC and director of the USC Dorsaif Center for the Political Future. He is one of the legends in the political consultancy world, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Bob, and we look forward to an incredibly vigorous discussion.
Thank you, Zev. You're kind of a legend in your own right, too. So I want to welcome everyone who's here in our Zoom audience. It's an honor to be back with all of you, and it's an honor to be part of this extraordinary panel. Let me start with this. We're in the midst of what President Obama has called the most consequential election of our lifetimes. It's also the most fraught presidential campaign I can remember. If you're for Joe Biden, rationally, you could say things look good, but people's anxiety levels seem to be off the charts. And among many, there's almost a borderline hysteria. So let me begin with this with the panel. How would each of you respond to that, to that disjunction between what your mind might tell you and what your heart might tell you? What would you say to those whom David Plouffe, Obama's campaign manager, former campaign manager, calls the bedwetters? And I don't care who starts, but if somebody doesn't volunteer, I'll pick somebody. Max, you want to start?
Okay. I guess I will speak up on behalf of the bedwetters here. I mean, I am in a state of anxiety myself, I have to say, because I feel like I'm kind of at war with myself right now, because my head is telling me that by all rights, this should be a Biden landslide, but my gut is saying, OMG, this could be a repeat of 2016. So I kind of have this war between my organs going on inside my body. And pretty much everybody I know is kind of freaking out right now, because of course, we saw what happened in 2016, where very few people thought Trump would win. And obviously he did in fact win. And now, I mean, I just don't see any way. I see 0% chance that Trump is going to win the popular vote, but it's not a 0% chance that he's going to win the Electoral College. 538 has it at about 12% right now, which is, not high, but it's not zero either. And we know that Trump is going to pull every dirty machination in the book to try to throw out mail-in ballots, to try to stop the counting of votes. And so I think it's just imperative that as many people as possible come out, cast their ballots, and put the election outcome out of cheating range, so that Trump cannot somehow claw his way to an undeserved victory, which is, I think, the only kind he's likely to get.
Jen and Lynn, you have to unmute yourselves. Jen, you want to respond to that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. Always nice to see my LA friends again. I look at it this way. We are all experiencing some post-traumatic stress syndrome. The last time we were here, we all had a very bad experience. And I think it is the echo of that, of being shocked, of being thrown off guard, of having something that we thought never in a million years could happen, actually happen, that has increased our anxiety. Let's put away our lizard brains, however, and turn on our rational brains and remind ourselves that simply because things went haywire once does not mean that they will go haywire from there on out. And I take solace in 4 different things. So I would encourage you to perhaps look at these. The first is an overwhelming outpouring of early voting. 93 million was the last I saw. I went back and looked. That's more total votes than voted in 1996. And it gives you a sense of the enthusiasm, the great outpouring and enthusiasm, particularly among Democrats who have gotten the message and have gotten out. Second, I would say that with all of that volume, things have gone pretty smoothly. We've seen a few little bumps and issues. There always is in a national election, but by and large, thanks to many private individuals and many state officials and local officials, things are so far going rather smoothly. The third thing I would look at is, and we can, I'm sure, get into this, is that Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton was much maligned, I think irrationally, illogically, but that's not who Joe Biden is. Joe Biden right now has a very favorable rating with the American people. In fact, he's one of the few candidates to go through a presidential election and come out more favorable than when he went in. And that is a tremendous asset. And lastly, I would say that we are no longer looking at the prospect of a businessman who's going to run government like a business. We're no longer looking at the packaging and the marketing and the guy who made his life in reality TV. We have a record, we have an experience, and we are going through a horror that very few of us have lived through in our lifetimes. And that has had real resonance with the American people. And I think more so than at any time, at least in my life, people now see a connection between their government and their existence, their physical existence. And I think people will vote in their self-interest. And so at this point, I'm feeling good. Ask me in a couple hours, I may not be feeling good. Ask me tomorrow, I may not be feeling good, but right now I'm feeling good.
Lynn, are you feeling good? And do you see a big difference that matters between Biden as a candidate and Hillary Clinton as a candidate?
I do. I think that there are a lot of notable differences, some of which people have already talked about, but also the kinds of campaigns that they're waging against the same candidate. Joe Biden is putting on a very different campaign than Hillary Clinton put on. Bob, I know you love to talk about my result about the content of economic mentions in the Clinton campaign in 2016. That share of mentions was small. There was not
9%, right? 9%.
Yes.
9%.
I love that you always remember the number. Yes.
Never talked about the economy. That's amazing for a Democratic candidate.
In a growing economy, incumbent party in a growing economy. Now, I always like to say that, I don't know anybody who would have found themselves in that election and not thought, wow, a clear path to victory is to point out, like, this guy really. So, you don't want to make too much of the fact that they thought that was the best strategy. But the Biden campaign is not doing that. They are highlighting COVID and the economy, as they should, in my view, because now the incumbent party is campaigning in a declining economy. And so holding them accountable for that, I think, is the right move. And you can see lots of ways that has had traction, not just in public polling, but in sort of the deep dive, more academic polling that we're all doing. So I think the campaigns are very different. If that's the outcome you're looking for, I think that's a reason to be happy.
Paul, and I've known Paul for, I guess, almost 40 years or maybe 40 years. I'm going to follow up on this by asking you about the polls. And we talked about the PTSD of 2016. And in its wake, there's a deep strain of skepticism or fear about the polls. Is the skepticism justified? And are the polls better today, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, than they were 4 years ago?
Well, skepticism about my industry is always justified. I don't know that they're any better or worse, but what happened in 2016 was largely happened at the state level, and in large part, not totally, because people stopped polling. And there was substantial movement toward Trump, as we all know, that last weekend because of the Comey letter, because of people trying to resolve their 20% of the electorate that year didn't like either candidate. And at the end of the day, most of those people ended up moving to Trump at the end. And then there were some demographic and sampling problems that have largely been worked out, but it's still an imperfect business. But I think there is so much evidence, unlike 2016, that in its content and breadth, I can state with absolute certainty, if the votes are going to be fully and fairly counted, Joe Biden will win. Now, there are some hitches, of course, Pennsylvania being an example where the absentee ballot process is different and new to people. And there's this naked ballot where you have had to sign a ballot and enclose it. So there are going to be some hitches along the way. But I'd go back to one basic thing, Bob, and that is that this is an incumbent president whose job ratings since somewhere in late 2017 essentially hit the low 40s and really hasn't deviated much in the last 3 years, nor has he tried to appeal beyond the 42 or 43% that have always liked him. And I think at the end of the day, most voters are making a judgment about Donald Trump. I see no evidence that there's going to be some massive swing or is some massive swing going on to him among undecided voters right now. I'm living in Wisconsin, and I can just feel that Wisconsin is very different this time than it was 4 years ago. Now, that's not to say it's not going to be tricky, because as people may realize, the early votes that get counted on Tuesday night will be election day votes. They're going to tilt toward the Republicans. And the votes that get counted later, and in some states it may be significantly later. It may not happen Tuesday night, maybe into Wednesday or Thursday. We've all gotten used to that in California. They're going to be overwhelmingly votes for Biden. So we're going to have to be a little bit patient, but hopefully we'll get some good news early. And the one place I would point people to is Florida. Florida counts as they go. Now, they're not reporting those counts, but all the early votes are being counted. They are ready to report and release those votes when the polls close. Now, we've all had history with Florida. We don't have to go back to 20 years to a bad memory we all have of Florida. But in Florida, there'll be over 10 million votes cast this year. If Joe Biden were to win Florida by just a percentage and a half or 2 points, that could be a margin of 200,000 votes. Trust me, the networks, if Florida looks like it's that kind of margin, they're going to call Florida Tuesday night. And once they do, there's almost no way for Trump to get to 270 electoral votes.
Yeah, I thought myself that Florida is the tell that you can watch on election night. Ohio's another one. If Biden would somehow or other win Ohio. Look, no
Georgia.
Republican, yeah, but no Republican's ever been elected president without carrying Ohio. And no Republican's been elected in 96 years without carrying Florida. So I think watch those two, and they're going to report pretty fast. Ohio also is in the process of going through its absentee ballots and its mail-in ballots and totaling them up. Now, we have this enormous pre-vote. 93, 96 million votes are already in. As someone noted, that's more votes than were cast in 1996. And it goes across the battleground states, except for Pennsylvania. What's wrong? Why are people not voting in person or at early voting sites in Pennsylvania? I think it's about 30%.
Yeah, they haven't had a history with it. And I used to live, grew up in Pennsylvania, and it's just alien, it's different, it's new. Pennsylvania is a little, I mean, if this were all coming down to Pennsylvania, and if Pennsylvania were closer in the polls than it seems to be, there's a pretty good consensus, Bob, at about a 5 or 6 point gap right now. And we've all learned 5 or 6 points is a heck of a lot different than 2 or 3. If it was more narrow, I'd be concerned because they have a Republican legislature. They've openly talked about putting up alternative electors potentially for the Electoral College. They're going to be challenging these ballots. We could have a difficult situation on our hands if it's close in Pennsylvania. I just don't think it is that close.
I'd also say that sometimes we forget what it looks like from the other side. Donald Trump has a very, very narrow path to victory. I see no state that he lost in 2016 that he is in a position to win this time. For a while, that might have been Minnesota or New Hampshire. Those are not happening. So in essence, he has to pull that inside straight, just like he did in 2016. And there are multiple ways in which that goes wrong. We've already talked about one of them is Florida, but there's also North Carolina, which has had a very large amount of early voting and now reports that sometime Tuesday evening, I think they mean euphemistically into the wee hours of Wednesday morning, that they'll have about 97% of the vote cast. And if Biden wins that, or if it is very, very close, that will be a bad sign for Donald Trump. And I would also not forget about Georgia. Not only is there a presidential race, which is competitive for the first time, I think since, 1992, perhaps, I think was the last time a Democrat won the state, but there are 2 Senate races, both of which are highly competitive, both of which have very strong Democrats running. So I think Georgia is another one of these big tell. And once again, it's not necessarily who wins a state, but what you see is these margins. If you see Texas as too close to call in the late hours, that is very bad news for President Trump. So sometimes even think about it the other way, bring up the map, the dreaded map that Trump likes to brag about from 2016, and then start taking off states like Wisconsin and Michigan, which we are fairly certain he's not going to win. It gets down to a very narrow path for him. Many things can go wrong. Everything has to go right for him to win. And I just agree with Paul and with Lynn that I just don't see a realistic path in which that's going to happen.
I mean,
Max, how nervous are you?
I'm sorry. Maybe this is irrational. This is emotional. Maybe I really am speaking on behalf of the bedwetters caucus here, but I'm still nervous. I mean, I can't help it because I was so certain in 2016, and I realize this is not 2016. Biden is in a much better position than Hillary was, but nevertheless, I can't help but remain nervous. And, part of what drives my nervousness is simply the continuing enthusiasm and support for Trump, because I feel like if there was any justice in this world, Trump's numbers would be down to the mid-20s by now. I mean, he has presided over a catastrophe, the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years, okay? I mean, we have 250,000 or close to 250,000 dead Americans. We have record unemployment. I mean, how is this guy still within spitting distance or cheating distance potentially of being reelected? I mean, it's astonishing to me. I mean, thank goodness that the odds are that he will lose, but it's just, I think, a terrible indictment of this country that there is still roughly 43% of Americans who are willing to give Trump a second term after we have seen the nightmare, the catastrophe, the disaster of his first term. And I've really been struck also by just watching the vast turnout of the enthusiasm at Trump rallies over the last few days. And I'm by no means buying into the Trump theory that, that audience turnout is what determines the outcome of elections, but it's still astonishing for me to see, especially when we've seen the hard data from Stanford University and other sources showing that large numbers of people have gotten sick at previous Trump rallies. We've had over 700 confirmed deaths at previous Trump rallies. And yet all these people, tens of thousands of them, are showing up at new Trump rallies without wearing masks. I mean, the level of irrationality or devotion or however you want, fanaticism, illogic, whatever you want to call it, to me, it's just astonishing. It's frightening. And I just feel like, okay, even if Biden wins and wins by a large margin, you're still going to be stuck with the fact that you have over 60 million Americans who are living in an alternative reality where Donald Trump is a phenomenally successful president and deserves a second term. And, I certainly hope that will not be the prevailing view. But even if our view prevails, this is still the reality of our country. And it's still pretty depressing for me to think about how many people, despite everything, back Trump, and to imagine what would have happened if we hadn't had this horrific pandemic, if we hadn't had this economic meltdown, if even after all that, Trump still has a 12% shot of winning.
And I would just add to what Max said, that there are dangerous times ahead here. Most of those people are going to believe this was an unfair result. And they're going to be told that it was an unfair result. He has already convinced them that the simple act of voting by mail is fraudulent, which is why most of them don't do that, even though it's demonstrably safer for their health, but they don't care. So we have ramifications beyond Tuesday, whatever happens, that are pretty serious and pretty daunting. And Max is absolutely right about that. The fervor that still exists there is extraordinary, and it will find an outlet.
I'm going to throw in a couple of things, and then Lynn will come to you. Ronald Reagan is kind of the modern record for defeating an incumbent president in terms of margin. I think it was 9.7%, although there was a third party candidate that was serious, which there isn't this year. So I don't know, Max, given how polarized we are, that if Biden wins by 9 or 10%, that's not pretty convincing. I agree with Paul that there will be angry people out there, but I think it'd be a pretty convincing victory. The other thing, and I mean this comparison only in the most limited possible way, I was George McGovern's speechwriter in 1972, and we were traveling around on the plane. And we had crowds you could not believe. In fact, on the Monday before the election, Monday night, our last stop, the Long Beach airport, the freeways were backed up for miles with people trying to come. And people, like, you get on the plane and somebody would say, well, these crowds, the polls can't be right. Well, the polls were right. So I think he has intensity, but I don't think he has breadth. And in fact, I think he's keyed his whole campaign to his base and has therefore failed to ever reach out to some of the people who voted for him, like suburban white women in 2016. And so he's in a kind of demographic cul-de-sac where he can whip up these folks and get great intensity. We got great intensity in 72, obviously, because people had very strong feelings about the Vietnam War. But the majority of the country had not gotten to where it was, say, 3 years later. Lynn, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so the McGovern story is a great example of what I was going to offer, which is, to quote Joe Biden, here's the deal. Democrats love their Democratic nominees and Republicans love their Republican nominees. And at the end of the day, roughly 9 out of 10 people who call themselves a partisan on either side are going to vote for the nominee of their party. Ever so, and probably ever will be, at least in our lifetimes. So what we're really talking about are a set of people who are really nonpartisan. And there are not that many of them, but there are enough. And then some people who are going to peel away from their partisan candidate. And all the data that I've looked at, and we've been interviewing 6,000 people a week, every week, for well over a year. So we've got 400,000 plus interviews. And no matter what group you want to break it out to, even Republicans, the president is doing less well among that group. There are a handful of exceptions to this, but the ones we've been talking about, the ones that he's campaigning to, he's doing less well with them in 2020 than he did in 2016. And so if Mike Murphy had been here with us tonight, he'd say, like, he's always running in that Republican primary. And that's what you're talking about, Bob, that he's stuck in that cul-de-sac. Like he's always pitching to the same group of people. So he has not expanded his set. But those solid partisans they're always going to go for their party's candidate.
I would add a couple things to what Lynn said. First of all, the affiliation with the Republican Party has really taken a dive. There was a Gallup poll out the months and years run together, but recently is what I can say, really showing that Republicans were down, I think it was 8 points. And not all of those flowed to the Democratic Party, but they did pick up votes. So it shows you that there are plenty of people, 2 of them are on this panel, that have essentially left the Republican Party because they were so appalled and alienated from a right-wing fascistic kind of mindset that they couldn't take it. So when you're talking about those partisans, the group of partisans on the Republican side is a little smaller than it was in 2016. The other thing that I would add, and it's not just because I'm doing a book on the subject, although I am, think about women. When you think about the quintessential voter, I would urge people to think very specifically of a woman. And that's not my bias. It's because that's 52 to 54, maybe 55% of the electorate. Women, larger share of the population and a much larger share of the electorate. And what's happened among women is the Republican Party has essentially crashed and burned. Donald Trump, if you recall, he didn't win women, although he keeps claiming that he did. He did win white women. There's a dispute as to exactly what that margin was. Exit polls show something a little bit different than later analysis did, but he won white women. And he certainly ran up a big lead among white, non-college educated women. It was stunning to me that with an advantage of, say, 25% roughly, that he had amongst that group of people in 2016. In the last national CNN poll, it was evenly split, 49-49 between Biden and Trump. That is an astonishing turnaround. And there is no state that you can win without women. This is not like going to a state that has lots of evangelicals or going to a state that has big cities. Every state has women. And that has been, I think, a singular failure on the part of the Republicans. And whatever he has tried to do, if you consider him trying to do anything to remedy that, has made it worse. His appeal to violence and craziness has only made people think better of Joe Biden on the law and order issue, for example. The issues that he has tried to raise on immigrants, child separation, was an enormous turnoff for women voters. So when you think of what's different then and what's different now, think of a white woman voter, maybe in the suburbs, college educated, not college educated, and think, does she think better of Donald Trump than she did before? And what has he done to make her life better or worse? And I think when you look at that, I hate to say segment of the electorate, they're a majority of the electorate. The Republicans have a huge problem. There's been a gender gap for decades now. There is now a gender canyon, a chasm, whatever metaphor you want to look at. And that is bad news in this election cycle for Republicans. And it's a really big problem going forward.
Anyone else want to come in on this?
The only thing I'd add, Bob, you know, it's the irony, brutal irony, as it turns out, is the pandemic was probably the one opportunity he could have had to change all this, despite everything that had come before it. And when he gave up sometime around April, I think he sealed his fate at that point because he essentially decided, this isn't a winner for me. It's typical Trumpian logic. I don't win here when people are dying, so I'm just going to forget about it. I'm going to go the other whole direction and look at the extraordinary calamity that has created. It's tragic. In my state, or I live in Wisconsin right now, we have one of the highest infection rates in the entire country, and it is largely in very pro-Trump areas, with a legislature that has fought our governor, who's trying to put lockdowns in and do the right thing. It's just shocking what they have decided to do for what they perceive to be their political interest, and it has backfired.
I think that's really interesting, and because there's a thought experiment I've engaged in. What if in late February, early March, Trump had called a press conference, said there's this terrible virus, we're going to try to keep it out of the country, we may not be able to, and you have to take all sorts of precautions. You have to at least social distance. And right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop campaigning. I'm going to go to the Oval Office. I'm going to focus on this and focus on how to save people's lives and marshal the resources we need to fight this. In the meantime, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx will brief you every day. I'm not a medical expert. I will come some of the time, but they will brief you. I think he'd probably be it was an inflection point, probably the last inflection point that he was going to get. He thought his inflection point was going to be Hunter Biden, which has gone nowhere. But this could have been a big inflection point. And I think it was, presidents have, these kind of crises come to presidents and they define presidencies. I mean, George W. Bush and the way he handled 9/11 and its aftermath. And I'm not talking about the Iraq war, but that was an inflection point because he was drifting downward in the polls. Suddenly he went way up. And I just think Trump blew the whole thing. He thought the election was in April, not November.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Bob is right, but of course, to imagine that counterfactual, one would also have to imagine Trump getting a personality transplant and being somebody entirely different from the person that he has been his whole life. But yeah, I mean, obviously he blew it, and I will say that, as somebody who opposed him from day one and thought he would be a catastrophic president, the scale of the catastrophe surprises even me. I mean, I certainly did not expect when I was, inveighing against Trump in 2016 that after 4 years of the Trump presidency, we would all be holed up at home. 250,000 people would be would be dead, and the economy would be in shambles. I mean, just the level of devastation is something even I didn't anticipate, even knowing how incompetent and awful Trump is. I mean, so he certainly, I would say, exceeded my very worst expectations. And yet, but I come back again to the point that, I would, have discussions prior to 2020 and with people and say, I thought his presidency was a catastrophe from day one. I mean, remember, the first thing he did was to screw up the airports by trying to implement this Muslim ban. I mean, it's been chaos and catastrophe from day one. And so, and yet he still has always been around 42% of the electorate supporting him. And so, I naively imagined prior to 2020, the one thing that could really knock him off course would actually be a recession or, a major catastrophe. And I kind of imagined him going the way of Richard Nixon when he was, trending down into the high 20s, I think, in approval by the time he had to resign. And you've seen those. I mean, just think about what's happened in the last year. The guy got impeached. I mean, he got caught red-handed trying to blackmail Ukraine. He became impeached. This is not something that happens. It's happened a handful of times in US history. And then he mismanages the pandemic. He mismanages the economy. I mean, this is crimes and catastrophes all together. And at the end of the day, the guy is still roughly the same approval rating he's always been. And he still has, according to, again, 538, a 12% chance of actually being reelected. I mean, to me, it's just mind-boggling that he has maintained his support, which I think really speaks to the tribal nature of his support in a way that a huge chunk of the American electorate has checked out of reality, and they live in this alternative bubble where they are fed BS from Fox News, and they're hooked. They're part of what people call the Fox News cinematic universe, and so they're utterly impervious to facts. They love Trump because he's the kind of the white right-wing Christian tribal leader, and so they flock to him despite his consequences because he's the leader of their tribe. And that, to me, even if he loses, which knock on wood he will, that to me is a terrible indictment of American democracy. And it's going to be a huge problem going forward because even if Trump leaves office, his tens of millions of supporters, they ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a minute and talk about the future of the Republican Party in a few minutes. But right now, I'd like to explore this Red Mirage that Paul alluded to, where Trump might have a lead on election night and what might happen. And Jen had a tweet this morning. She said, no state finishes counting and certifies the results by midnight on election day. Kavanaugh, and she's referring to Justice Kavanaugh, who wrote a majority opinion in a case on the deadline for mail-in ballots, not only made that up, but is historically ignorant. You're blunt. If this is originalism, it's hocus pocus. Now, Trump is trying to push the same theory too. And he may, we can't be sure, his people said it today and then he kind of denied it, declare victory on election night, despite what could be a 9 or 10 point Biden win if all the votes were counted. What would the consequences, how do we stop that, number one? And number two, what would the consequences be for our democracy if this happened?
Well, I think we need to look at two halves of this. The first is reality. And reality does matter, and preparation for reality matters a lot. The most important group of people in the United States, sorry, Supreme Court, sorry, voters, is the decision desk at the Associated Press, because they are going to be the ones that most of the networks, that most of the press outlets look to. And there is no way that they are going to call an election in any decisive fashion if there is a theoretical possibility that one or the other candidate can still win. And they have said that they're going to be very transparent in that, and they're going to, I think, share with that with the election desks. So we're not going to have an official call. We're going to have Donald Trump out there saying, I won, I won. And that may be more or less realistic depending upon what's actually happened. Again, reality. If he has lost North Carolina or he has lost Florida, he can say he's the Queen of England and it won't make any difference. But so what happens? Big outcome, big landslide, really reduces his ability to do that. But I would also say that he says all kinds of things. He says he's a stable genius. No one really believes that either. And this is in that category. And here is where I think the media really needs to consider what they're doing. If they cover that live, that announcement that he's going to make, if they treat this as, well, Trump says he won and the AP and every other credible source says he didn't, gosh, let's have one on from the Trump campaign to explain this crackpot theory, and let's have one on from the other side. That will do great damage to the legitimacy of the election. You will have people who sincerely believe that there is some doubt as to the outcome. If, however, and I would hope and pray that this is the case, that all through the evening, the networks are preparing people, are telling people, this is how much is outstanding. There's nothing suspicious or weird or funky going on when it takes a while for votes to be counted. We can't call a state because only a small fraction of the vote is in. If they do their job in any competent, reasonable action and manner, it's not that no one's going to believe Trump. His little Fox viewership is, of course, going to believe him. But the vast majority of Americans, even people who didn't vote for him, I think will kind of, I see Paul shaking his head in disgust, who will resist that. It doesn't mean that they're going to accept this, that they aren't going to start, with this, he's not really president routine. But I think the party leaders, I think the Senate, I think the House will proceed. There will be a new Congress, there will be a new president, and the wheels of the government continue to chug on and on and on. So I think it's up to all of us. It's up to the media. It's up to professional pollsters. It's up to the Associated Press to put what he is doing in context so people can discern between reality and not reality. But I will be frank, I will be much, much happier and much, much more confident that we're not going to have violence. We're not going to have a huge physical dysfunction, political dysfunction rather, if some of those states that actually do complete counting on election night go Biden's way, because I think that will serve to, if not entirely, at least partially short circuit this effort.
And that's why the reason I was shaking my head, I don't think it's AP that matters. I think it's the decision desk at Fox News that matters. And we remember the little walk that Megyn Kelly took in the middle of 2012, when all of a sudden that there was this notion that Karl Rove was putting out there that Obama was in some trouble, and she went and live. That's when Roger Ailes was still there, corrected that, and all of a sudden the picture became clearer. If Florida or Georgia or North Carolina or one of these states that you just talked about, Jennifer, that if they're clear cut and Fox makes the call, then that starts to line this thing up in a way that that starts to cut off the avenues of escape for the Trump world. And I am very worried about violence. And let me just say a couple of things. It sets up a process where some Republicans who have cowed because of Donald Trump for 4 years have the ability to potentially go to him and say, you got to stand down. It sets up a situation where some of these crazies out there don't resort to violence because they think that some election commission in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or somewhere is stealing the election. It sets up a dynamic where we can start to get toward normalcy. But here's my worry. Fox may have decided, for all we know, that Donald Trump is an existential threat to them. And the reason is because if he loses, he may very well, and he feels like Fox was part of the deal, he may very well set up an alternative network and try to take Fox out, and he might have the power to do it. So I'm still worried that I'm not talking about Hannity and all the rest of the garbage on Fox. I'm talking about real people who do this for a living in their news department, making the same judgments they've always made that the other networks do. If they are with the program, we have a different reality. If they're not, then God save us, because I worry about all of those bad outcomes, even with a fairly clear-cut Biden victory.
Yeah, I would hate to depend on the integrity of Fox News as being the safeguard of our election.
But it's not a small audience. It's not a little audience. It's a big audience, and it matters.
The person in charge of their decision desk, as I understand it, is actually fiercely independent. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't override him, but when they walked Karl Rove down the hall, they walked him in to where the decision desk was, and the guy looked up and said, "You're wrong. That's not happening. Romney is not catching up. Obama's not in trouble." Lynn, do you have anything on this? You worry about violence?
I was just going to say that, I think, Paul, you probably know the guys who run the Fox News poll, and
they're straight. Absolutely.
And those are some of the same people that are working the decision desk. And so if that plays a big role, which I think that's the right way to think about it, elite opinion leaders can influence mass opinion. And so you've seen really well over the last few years how the president can influence opinion among Republicans and also galvanize opinion of people who don't like him, but so can the news outlets too. Anybody who's an elite and in a position to talk to a lot of people has the opportunity to be an opinion leader. So I think that's a good, it's a good prescription of what to look for as Tuesday night kind of unfolds. And I've even been trying to gauge this yesterday and today, and I'll continue this into Tuesday, just watching the coverage on Fox and seeing if it's changing. And, this could just be me with, my faulty lenses on, but I think it is changing a little bit. So that would be another thing that I'd be looking at.
But it's changing how, Lynn?
Well, suggesting that these Biden rallies are well attended, just things that giving a lot of airtime to the Biden rallies, just uninterrupted, playing them straight, playing the Obama part of it straight, and just things that I thought were a little unusual.
Before we go to Q&A, I want to talk about the future a little bit. And as I think Jen noted, two of you on this panel have traditionally been Republicans. My colleague at USC, Mike Murphy, says he's renting Biden this year. And then he wants to see the restoration of an authentically conservative GOP. If Trump loses, where should and will the Republican Party move? Is it just going to remain Trumpist?
That is the $64,000 question.
That's why I ask it.
You got to the nub of it. Part of the difficulty for the Republican Party and part of the explanation for why Trump won in the first place is that conservatism is now incoherent and politically untenable. There is virtually no one in America who really wants small government. Everybody just wants their part of government, but you do not see any significant portion, even of Republicans who want to repeal Social Security, who want to do away with Medicare. There has been a consensus in this country that is at odds with a 1980s version of conservatism. And what has happened is that brand of conservatism has gotten farther and farther away from public opinion. And what Republicans have done in order to preserve their share of the electorate and their power is two things. Number one, lie about what they're in favor of. I have a health plan, it's going to be better. I am for pre-existing condition protection. And the other thing is suppress the vote of non-white voters. And that has been how they have tried to limp through this divergence between what was a conservative viewpoint and what is actually sellable to the American people and what is actually possible. So I think the question is not between, is it a battle between Trump, which is this right-wing populist authoritarian view, and a rerun of Ronald Reagan? I think it's between Trump and whether there is anyone on the center right who can come up with a coherent, sane approach to governance that is competitive in the marketplace. It has been done. We have some very successful Republican governors around the country. Mr. Hogan in Maryland, Mr. Baker in Massachusetts, to name two. So it is possible to come up with something that is not democratic progressivism. But until they do, I think the Republicans are going to suffer from this disconnect. And that's one reason why, number one, a big victory is so important, because it strengthens the hand of the people who say, this Trump thing did not work out. This was a disaster. Let's leave this behind. And number two, it allows Democrats to get into power to do things like fix the Voting Rights Act, take other measures that makes it harder and harder for Republicans to jimmy the system. And if they can't jimmy the system, they might actually have to appeal to voters and figure out what they want and actually talk to real people and figure out, hey, the white population really is declining. Women really are in the workplace. Maybe we should come up with an agenda that actually responds to them. So I think that's kind of the lay of the land. Which way it's going to go, I think it has a lot to do with how big the victory is and frankly, how much incentive there are for some people still within the Republican Party to try to push back. I would end with this, and that is Republicans have another problem, and that is people like Max and I are in no hurry to go back to the Republican Party. So they are dealing with a narrower and more, I think, extreme slice of the electorate than ever before. I'm not going to forgive and forget. I don't want to go back. I think they've lost the moral authority to lead. I think sort of like, the Hebrews in the desert, if they all die out, then the next generation might be able to come into the promised land. But these people have forever, I think, forfeited their moral authority to lead. So it's really hard for a party to reform and revise itself if the people who were most reform-minded and most aware of this divergence between their philosophy and the electorate have left the party. Welcome, Democrats. You have a chance to be an enormous consensus party for a very long time.
Yeah, but let me just say three quick things. Number one, every politician is worried first off about their own survival. And until I see any proof otherwise, most Republicans are going to say, if I go too far in the other direction, I'm going to get taken out in a primary by somebody who's going to stand up there and say, you weren't for Donald Trump strongly enough, or you're still not for Donald Trump strongly enough. So this strain is going to be there for a while. The second thing I'd say is, other than the Whigs, we generally seem to have this history of these parties surviving and reforming themselves. George McGovern, to go back to him, Bob, he lost 48 states, and Mondale lost 49 states. Mondale lost 48, I forget. But guess what? Jimmy Carter won 4 years later. And after Mondale, Bill Clinton won 8 years later. So it's a harsh thing to start saying that they can't recreate themselves at some point. the final thing, though, is the big problem they have, and Jen alluded to this, is demographic. I mean, they're into voter suppression for a very real reason. They know that if the American people fully expresses their viewpoints, they're dead. You know, they're losing millennials, they're losing minorities. They've made some attempt to try to get the Latino vote back, but I think it's going to have mixed success. And the demographics are horrific for them. If they just think about it, what if we break through in Texas, whether it's this year or 2 or 4 years from now, they've got nothing left. They're going to have to recreate themselves, but I would argue it may take longer than you think.
Yeah, I mean, my view is I wrote a column last week saying we have to destroy the Republican Party in order to save it. I think it's pretty hopeless at this point. Now, I think the best hope is basically to have a very different party that still goes under the Republican label. I mean, that's happened many times in the past. I mean, if you look at the ideological content of the Republican Party, it's changed pretty dramatically since the 1850s, right? On a number of different occasions. But what you've seen in the last 40 or 50 years is basically, long before Trump came along, the Republican Party drove out all the other elements of the coalition. There used to be, as we all know, a progressive Republican wing, what people used to call the Rockefeller Republicans, right? They no longer exist. And the Republican Party became solely identified with ideological conservatism. And then ideological conservatism became crazier and crazier, denying science, getting mired into conspiracy theories, getting into race baiting. And Trump is kind of the culmination of all those trends, and he's brought them up to a new level. And I do think it's imperative to defeat the Republican Party to signal to them that they cannot continue on the present path. But I'm not all that optimistic that even a massive repudiation on Tuesday will lead the Republican Party to change course, because they're going to have alibis, right? Because Trump is going to say, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world, and then the China virus came along, the Wuhan virus, it's all the Chinese fault. So he's going to have this automatic alibi that a lot of Republicans are going to buy. And as Jen was alluding to, when you shrink the Republican Party, the core that remains is going to be crazier than ever. You're probably going to have in the next Congress Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a QAnon believer from Georgia, who's going to be a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. That's going to be the kind of people who are going to be in the House. And remember that in the past, Republican leaders like John Boehner and Paul Ryan already thought that the House Republican caucus was almost unmanageable. Well, we're going to look back on those days, and we're going to see, the Devin Nuneses and others who have been in the Republican caucus. Now they're going to see normal and moderate by comparison to the next crop that's coming along. And yes, there are sane Republicans out there like Larry Hogan, very few, John Kasich, Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker. In terms of Mitt Romney, in terms of elected officials, you can basically count them on one hand. And yes, if in 2024, Larry Hogan could be the nominee of the Republican Party, that would be pretty dramatic. But if I had to bet right now, my money would be that, Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump Jr. would have a greater chance of winning the Republican nomination in 2024 than Tucker Carlson. I mean, long term, I think we all agree the Republicans are in a death spiral. You cannot be a white supremacist party in a country which is majority minority, which we will be by the 2040s. Young people have turned against them, people of color. There's just not enough undereducated white people to preserve the Republican Party at a national level. They're going to wind up like the Republican Party in California, which has all but ceased to exist. That's the long term. But the question is, how do you get from here to there? And my concern is it's going to take more than one defeat to convince the Republicans that this is, that they have to change course, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of pressure from the base, from Fox News, from all these crazies to keep pushing them. And remember, and this is final word of caution, remember how previous Democratic presidencies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama drove Republicans nuttier, right? They were into conspiracy theories about Whitewater, about birtherism, whatever. It drove them even more over the edge. So can you imagine how they're going to react to the presidency of Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, an African-American woman? I mean, they are going to go, they're going to go pretty nuts, I think, over the course of the next 4 years. So the Republican Party really needs to be wiped out in its current configuration, but that's not going to happen in one election.
And we forget how long a party can remain in the political wilderness. After Herbert Hoover, the next Republican president was Eisenhower in 52. That's how long they toiled in the desert. And it's not inconceivable to me. Hey, we have both the Depression and the 1918 flu. It could be, I don't know, 20, 30 years before a Republican is trusted back in the White House.
Clinton and Obama both lost the Congress in their 2 years after they were elected. So let's not get too cocky here.
There you go.
Lynn, I want to let you weigh in on this because you do talk to thousands of people, as we do with our USC Dornsife Daybreak poll. Don't we have to have two parties in this country that are fit to govern? Because sometimes the other party's going to win. And is there any prospect that the Republican Party will become that?
So I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind in thinking about the future of the party. And the first is there's sort of never been a more important time to say it matters who runs for office. And what I mean by that is not just going forward, but that's a window on what happened in 2016 too. So Donald Trump won the 2016 election by activating and making more salient than anything else these identity-inflected issues about race, ethnicity, religion, gender. And how close, he didn't create those attitudes. This is what's important to keep in mind. He did not create those attitudes. Anybody who's looked at public opinion data over the last 75 years understands that those attitudes were always there. They're there in the Democratic Party, they're there in the Republican Party. And he lit them up. Now, what that means is that those Republican voters were always in the party. It was just that candidates like John McCain and Mitt Romney and others who ran before Donald Trump didn't choose to make that the dimension on which the conflict was being fought. And this is the part that just, I think, is critical to remember, the 16 other Republicans who were standing on that stage with Donald Trump in 2015, if any of them had won the nomination, we wouldn't be where we are today talking about this. So it was one candidate. That one candidacy really changed now the way we think about whether the Republican Party can go on in the future in its current form. And when I think about this, I think the question is, from where will the leaders of the party emerge? And so you guys have talked about there are a handful of people who seem reasonable to lead it back, to sort of put this stuff back where it was pre-Trump. I know people disagree on this. People who work in politics disagree about whether these issues can subside back to the level they were before Trump, or whether they will now be the defining issues in the Republican Party. And as Paul said, candidates are worried about being primaried, and maybe there isn't a lot of leadership in the Republican Party to come up and make a new dimension, the dimension of conflict. But I like to think that there are people, even if they're not people who are in politics right now, who can step forward and reimagine what that new dimension might look like, because the voters are the same voters. And so it's just a matter of what gets activated, and it matters who you're running against. And so those primaries are really important, and who these candidates are really important. And I guess that's just a way to say that, if you have Republican friends who are considering running for office and you think they're decent people, you got to encourage them to run for office. If there are not people to run, then we will have the set that you see now.
How about this? How about if Trump tries to pull a Grover Cleveland? Cleveland was elected, defeated, and then, I think that could happen. I want to get to one last quick go-around question and then go to audience questions. By the way, as a point of personal privilege, Paul, I have to say, I'm proud I worked for George McGovern and not Richard Nixon. We didn't get to the White House, but none of us went to jail. So if Biden wins, is there any genuine prospect that we can heal or begin to heal the divisions and wounds in American society today? And we'll just go around the horn.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, it's not going to be, don't go crazy with your fantasy, but can we get back to some normal level of partisan competition? I think the answer is yes. But I think I'll just keep talking.
I thought that the strongest thing he could have done, and he never really did it in the debate, would be to make your exact point that there's folks, I can't promise everything. It's not going to be hunky-dory. We're not going to just get all along so easily. We have divisions, but if you want a little bit of normalcy, a little bit of a path back to the America you thought you knew and recognized, there's one simple thing you can do, which is take this man and remove him from office. And I wonder if Biden even now, I think he believes it. I think, Bob, one of the great strengths of Joe Biden this year is he has understood his message from the very beginning. You know, you and I have seen candidates for all these years, and we can really differentiate the ones who are comfortable with why they're running and the ones who aren't. And I won't name names, but we've seen some that have not been. He is very comfortable. I think he understood what he is in contrast to what is there now. But it's going to be very difficult the minute he takes office, both internally within his own party and with the country as a whole. I'd like to be an optimist on this question. I am skeptical that unity or harmony is going to be necessarily something we're talking about 6 months from now.
I would say a couple things. One is Biden very consciously did raise this issue. He was criticized by people in his own party in the primary for saying he could make deals, he could reach across the aisle. And his answer was very compelling, which is, what choice do you have? You cannot have a democracy if you don't do that. You're never going to win all the time. You're never going to win in such large majorities. You have to be able to do that. So I think he did run on that. He is, I think, temperamentally inclined to try to do that. And I think we will get to a inflection point relatively quickly. I suspect, I have no inside knowledge of this, I suspect that if he is the nominee, there will be a point in which he, and if the Senate is in Democratic hands, they go to either the Senate leadership or certain Republicans and they say, here's your choice. We have certain things we must accomplish. We understand you may vote against them, but if you are willing to allow these at least to come to the floor, we won't touch the filibuster. You tell me that's not possible, it's gone. And we're going to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can. And that ranges everything from so-called packing the court to adding a couple seats, a couple states rather, which would be 4 seats in the Senate, to all sorts of things that would hopefully kind of bug the system, as it were, that would root in Democratic control for a long time. And I think it's at that point where we find out whether there is anyone on the Republican side who is willing to at least talk in those kinds of bargaining terms that we haven't heard for 4 years or so. And whether there's anyone who says, you know, this is a better way to go rather than blowing up the Senate, blowing up the country, blowing up the Supreme Court. And a lot is going to depend on what that Senate majority looks like if, in fact, the Democrats do take the Senate. It's very different if they have 51 people or if they have 56 or 57 people. It's very different if some red state incumbents lose than if they get by and just the obviously vulnerable senators get picked off. That will make a lot of difference in that conversation.
What I think I'm going to do now, unless somebody feels compelled to say something more about this, is I want to go to these audience questions because we have a ton of them. We'll never get through them. I hope we get through some of them. By the way, Jen, I have to tell you, the great advocate of Puerto Rican statehood was a guy named Ronald Reagan, who today might be regarded as a rhino in the Republican Party since he made deals with Kennedy on immigration and with Tip O'Neill on Social Security. So the first question is from Stuart. Was it a smart strategy for Biden to seek to expand his electoral map? Anybody who wants to take this can take it.
I'll take it right off the bat. Absolutely. They have plenty of money, as you've noticed. They are not lacking for funds. And believe me, I can say that they have not done anything to diminish the effort in Wisconsin or Michigan, unlike 2016. They're fanning out and running an entire effort today and tomorrow in Pennsylvania. But for Biden to start to put a flag down in Georgia, obviously Arizona was a big part of this campaign from the beginning, and even Texas, which wasn't a lot of money and it only came late. This is not the arrogance of Hillary Clinton. This is a guy that the comment that Jen just made. This is a guy who understands that if he can take this party and begin to break through in their areas, in their base, that's a profoundly different country than the one that is just simply red or blue. So I'm going to say I don't have any qualms or quibbles about Biden's strategy. I think it's been dead on.
Anyone dissent from that? Well, maybe I'll go to the next question, which actually reflects the spirit of my opening remarks about people being on the ledge. Ted asks, what is the worst possible scenario that you see ahead?
I mean, I was actually part of this war game that was run by something called the Transition Integrity Project, where we actually months ago, where we looked at possible post-election scenarios, and a lot of them were pretty grim. The really grim ones were where what would happen if Biden wins the popular vote by a substantial margin, but the electoral college vote is very, very close, within 10, 15 votes, 20 votes, something like that, where flipping a single state could be enough to change the outcome, and where there's a lot of disputes about mail-in ballots, about the integrity of the election. Republicans make all these specious claims of fraud and hoaxes, which they're doing now. And so we kind of war game that out, and I was playing the Trump campaign, and others were playing the part of the Democrats and the courts and the media and other actors, and it got ugly pretty fast, because what we discovered is there's a lot of room for mischief, especially in states like Pennsylvania, where you may have a Democratic governor, but you have a Republican-controlled legislature, and they have the capacity, theoretically, under the Constitution, to send in an alternative slate of electors, where the government can certify one slate, and the legislature, controlled by the Republican Party, can certify an alternative slate based on their theory that Trump really won, were it not for this supposed election fraud. And then it's not clear what happens, and it could very well wind up being decided by the Supreme Court. And look at the Supreme Court. I mean, it is very heavily Republican right now, and Trump is not exactly making a secret of the fact that he expects the Supreme Court to essentially elect him president. We saw that happen even on a less partisan court in 2000, where the justices basically voted along partisan affiliation. Now, the Republicans are even more heavily in control. And, are you going to count on Brett Kavanaugh or Amy Coney Barrett or one of those justices to vote against the Republican Party in an election dispute? I mean, that would seem like a very poor wager. So, I mean, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but this could very readily happen if the Electoral College is very close. That's why it would be such a nightmare if it is, and why it's so important that Biden win in a landslide, because if it doesn't, we very soon get into these questions that have to do it with the very integrity of our democracy, and you're going to see massive street protests. There's no really good outcome at that point. It's going to be very ugly.
That was rather bleak. I am told, by the way, that there is an obscure provision of an 1877 federal law passed after the 1876 election dispute that says that if there are two slates of electors submitted by a state, the one that is signed by the governor is the one that should prevail. Now, should prevail and will prevail may be two different things. So we have a ton of questions here. We're never going to get through them. Cy asked, do you think there's a realistic possibility that Trump would leave office after conceding? Or is he going to try to stay there?
Will he concede?
Yeah.
I don't think he'll concede. I do think when somebody said to me, why is he skipping out on the second debate? My instant pop reaction was because he's researching extradition policies. And I don't want to be precisely totally facetious about that. I think that
the only unrealistic part of that is the notion that Trump would do any research, but go ahead.
So you're right about that, Max. Absolutely. You're right. I think he is most of all concerned about Donald Trump. And if he believes that there's some mechanism that Pence can save him from a jail term, that I wouldn't rule out any possibility, Bob. None.
The hitch in that, of course, is that no pardon is going to save him from New York prosecutors. And for that, he really does need to find a country with no extradition treaty to the United States, because that's the only thing that's going to save him from that.
He's not going to concede, but if the election outcome is certified, if the Electoral College decides, and if Congress certifies the Electoral College result, he will be forced to leave office on January 20th. I mean, the Secret Service is not going to defend him and keep him in the White House beyond noon on January 20th. That's not going to happen.
Okay, let's switch to another, perhaps rosier question. Leland asks, who will win control of the Senate?
The Democrat.
Lynn, you want to try that?
I was gonna throw it to Paul. He's got better data.
Yeah, and I don't want to go through them one by one, but I will say this, that Jen paints a picture which is not impossible. We've had these wave elections before. 1980, I was there when Pat Caddell called up Carter and said, you're going to lose. And I remember looking at the map that Pat had on his wall and saying, Carter won't fly. He was in Seattle. He had to fly back to Plains. He's not going to fly over a single state that he's going to win tomorrow. And secondly, it dawned on me, we're going to lose the Senate, and we lost it big. So it's certainly not beyond the possibility that the Democrats could win something like, 8, 9, 10 seats. I think probably something more in the range of 5 or 6 is more realistic. But I'm pretty confident the Democrats are going to win the Senate.
So we have a question here from Mark. Are there secret or shy Trump voters who are reticent to tell pollsters who they support?
Go ahead.
Well, Paul, I'd be curious to see if you agree with me on this. People say this all the time. And if for that to be true, the mechanism that has to be at work there is that they don't want to admit to the pollster that they're going to vote for Trump because, who knows why. But the idea is that there's something about saying that to the person that makes them reluctant to admit it. If that were true, then all of these polls that are being done online, where there's no interviewer involved, should show a really different result than the ones with an interviewer, and they don't. So I don't think this is a real thing.
They're willing to risk their lives and not wear a mask. I mean, come on, telling a pollster? Yeah, I think the issue is, I think it's a confused issue. It's not, people go back to the Bradley effect and things that have to do with racial politics and think that there's some reticence here about Trump. There's no reticence about Trump. There is an issue about whether there is, I wouldn't call it reluctance, I would call it defiance, which is some parts of that base that simply say, I ain't ever talking to anybody on the phone, I'm sorry. And because you guys are part of that. You're part of the establishment, the horrible liberal news media, whatever, I ain't talking to you. And that is a worry about exit polls that we've all come to realize that there's been a bias in exit polling for that very reason. So it's not shyness, it's defiance. And I do think that if there's a shock on Tuesday night that hasn't been created by Vladimir Putin, it would be that there could be some understating still of Trump's vote because of the polls in that regard. I don't believe that it's true, but that's the element, Bob. That's not shyness. It's a different dynamic.
Yeah, in our USC Dornsife data, we actually think there are some shy Biden voters, and they're probably non-college educated white women who will not tell a live pollster in front of their husbands, for example, that they're going to vote for Biden. So we think there might be some shy or reticent Trump voters in certain areas, but they're probably pretty much balanced out by some reticent Biden voters. We have another question here that I think is interesting. What do you think of the Lincoln Project, and I might add Republican Voters Against Trump, which have broadcast all of these ads designed to peel away not a majority of Republicans, but to get 9, 10, 11% of Republicans not to vote for Trump, which seems in some of the data to be happening. I mean, this is unprecedented. I mean, you have some of the best, most creative strategists in the Republican Party have actually been going after Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it's been huge. And I think, those of us like Jen and myself who have been part of the Never Trump caucus, we've endured for 4 years having all the Trumpkins kind of jeer at us and say, nobody cares what you think, you're rhinos, you're losers, we're in charge, we're going to beat our chest, you guys are, go off and kill yourselves, you can't do anything to affect us. But what we saw, I think in 2018 was in fact that there was a significant Never Trump vote, which shifted a lot of suburbs, even in places like Arizona and Texas, away from the Republican Party and gave the Democrats a 40-seat majority in the House. And I think there are certainly signs this year that you're seeing a similar effect with, as you mentioned, Bob, like, defections, 9, 10, maybe 12% of Republicans moving away from Trump, and a lot of independents moving away from Trump, a lot of suburban voters who might otherwise be friendly to Republicans. So, I mean, the kind of the jokes on the Republicans, because the never Trumpers could actually turn out to be decisive, and not never Trumpers like Jen and me, obviously not folks in the media, but actual normal Republicans out there who are just disgusted by Trump's antics.
I would also say a few things. One, they're just really good at what they do. And I think they have raised the bar in political advertising and maybe given a little shot in the arm to some Democratic ad makers to be bold, to be mocking, to be irreverent in that sense. Number two, they have gotten under Trump's skin multiple times. And every time he goes down one of these rabbit holes, he's not talking about something that might theoretically help him with the electorate. Third, they have done Senate ads. And that, I think, may be places where you could get some ticket splitting. You could get some Republicans saying, well, even if I'm going to vote for Trump, yeah, Lindsey Graham's, not my cup of tea. I'm going, he's been a wimp. I'm getting rid of him, which is irrational, of course, because his opponent is a staunch Democrat, but be that as it may. So I think Senate races. And lastly, they've driven a lot of the coverage. They've driven a lot of the media coverage. And what the media talks about, no matter how the Republicans grouse, matters a lot. And people have seen that walking down the ramp business at West Point millions of times by now. So it does have an effect. And I would hope that they stay in the game. I think they are, at least the Lincoln Project people are. And I would hope that some of what they've done has kind of rubbed off on the Democrats. These guys know how to win. And I would hope that the Democrats learn something.
Bob, can I just throw, I just want to throw two things in there. The first, from a social psychology point of view, what RVAT has done is really important because they've given people permission who voted in 2016 for Trump to leave that vote behind and do something else. And they've done that by showing people in their own voices, explaining, I did this and I'm going to do this other thing now, and it's okay, you can do it too. Instead of just criticizing people, look what you did to the country, you idiots. No, they've given people permission to recognize that they can change their mind and that that's a reasonable thing to do. So that was, from a social psychology perspective, a really great move. And then just because I know time is running out, I just want to throw one thing out there. I don't mean to change the topic, but at some point, just Pete Buttigieg, like this, we need more of this guy on the cable news channals too. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
It's wonder, actually, when you put Buttigieg on Fox, it's unbelievable to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, I just say they're true patriots. I'm so glad for them. Whatever happens beyond November, what they've done is extraordinary.
That we have a lot of other questions are very interesting. One of them, for example, is why are a not insignificant number of Jewish voters supporting Trump, and what would Jennifer recommend be said to them about Israeli issues? My own view of this is that looking at the data, Biden's going to get about the same percentage of the Jewish vote that Democratic candidates normally get. But I want to give everybody a chance here for some closing remarks. So, each of you can take a minute and a half or something like that and try to sum this up, and let's talk people off the ledge.
Well, I'll start. We've all been on that ledge. This is the most, Bob and I do go back a long time. I put my whole life and career into this, and there have been times in the last 4 years where I've questioned, what was this all about? We all have some responsibility for what this country is becoming, and we've seen the worst of it in this last year. I think back to when he went out into Lafayette Square. And he was hurt by that, by the way. That was a signal moment in this campaign that hurt Donald Trump significantly. No matter how much they tried to go to looting and fires and riots in Seattle and the world, no one's in New York, by the way. New York's totally shut down. I don't know if anybody realized that. And yet, at the end of the day, we've got a light, I believe. It's not a tunnel. We have a light, and we have a chance. This country is still going to be tested. This virus ain't going away. I can speak to that. 5,000 cases a day right now in Wisconsin. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And we're going to be tested in ways that we've never been tested before. But in their great judgment, I think the American people are about to render a pretty convincing verdict. I hope they are. And I think that at least will allow us the opportunity to build on it and restore a democracy that frankly I've never thought would be as threatened as it has become. So that from that standpoint, Bob, I guess we're backing away from the ledge, but we're not far.
Lynn?
I'll just throw out that there are a lot of things that Americans agree on. So if you're thinking, someone said earlier, we're so polarized. The parties have very different priorities. The things they think are important are very different, but Americans are of the same mind on a bunch of things. Universal gun background checks, path to citizenship for dreamers. So there are just, $15 minimum wage. There are lots of things that a majority and a strong majority of people in the country want. And that should give everyone a little bit of hope that clever political entrepreneurs can somehow take advantage of that. Everybody wants a lopsided issue. That's a real winner. So I think there's an avenue for that, including the last thing that is lopsided. Fox News poll has been asking this question, I think is great for a long time. If you could send the government one message, would you tell them, leave me alone or lend me a hand? And for the first time, the lend me a hand has a strong majority. 57% of Americans said they would tell the government, lend me a hand. After the global financial crisis, it was 44%. So this really is a unique moment in time, ripe for someone who does want to unify people to come in and leverage those things on which people are lopsided.
Max?
I mean, I really think that this election is a character test for American democracy. And my vantage point on it is from somebody who came here when I was 7 years old in 1976 from the Soviet Union, thanks to Zeph and David and so many other people on this call who are active in the struggle for Soviet Jewry. And I've always had this kind of elevated idealistic view of the United States as that city, that shining city on a hill, the last best hope of Earth. And my faith in this country has been pretty battered the last 4 years. I mean, there are times when I've really despaired and lost hope. And I think this is an opportunity to rediscover what it is that has made this country truly great for all these centuries, and to, stand up against the forces of division and demagoguery and to vote for the better angels of our nature. I think this is really our last best chance to save American democracy, because if you look at Trump, I think he's turned out to be much worse, much more malevolent, much more destructive than I anticipated in 2016. And I was completely opposed to him from day one, but he's turned out to be worse. I mean, can you imagine what he would do in a second term if he is given a chance at re-election? If after everything he's done in the first term, then he wins re-election, he will take that as an endorsement of every abuse of power he's committed and an invitation for more. So that to me is just so unthinkable, so much worse than his victory in 2016, which can be written off as an aberration, whereas this would be a result that would shake American democracy to its foundation. And I'm not sure that our democracy in its present form would survive. So that is such a horrific outcome. I refuse to believe it's even possible. And I just hope and pray that everybody goes out there, votes, and make sure it doesn't happen, because I think there's still a lot of good things about this country, and we have to vote for the good and to cast out some of the terrible things that we've seen in the past 4 years.
Jen?
Well, I would look at the green shoots of democracy, or the antibodies of democracy that have kind of been activated during the Trump years. There are millions of people, literally millions of people, who were not active in politics before, who have become active in politics. New people who have run, new people who have formed groups like Indivisible, new people who have decided to join campaigns or run their own campaigns. And I think Donald Trump did scare us and awaken something in us. And although we look at the Senate with great despair that there are virtually no Republicans at the national level who push back against Trump, We have a vibrant free press that has more or less done their job during the Trump years. We have dedicated civil libertarians, lawyers who have pushed back, many of them state attorneys generals who have litigated and litigated and litigated to preserve everything from EPA regulations to prevent Trump from punishing so-called sanctuary cities. There have been lots of efforts by lots of people throughout America to try to push back against this. And I think the Lincoln Project people, other people are evidence that there is still a great, deep, abiding love of democracy in this country. 93 million people turn out to vote early. That is extraordinary. We had huge numbers of people turn out in 2018. That was extraordinary. So I think before we write off democracy and we write off the American experiment, we should look and see. There are dedicated patriots who have defied these barriers. There are many Republicans, they may not be in office, but many Republicans who have stood up to Trump, most of them out of office already. And we've also had some military leaders, frankly, who have pushed back, who have either overstepped and then corrected course or simply stood their ground. So lots of green shoots of democracy, and let's hope they spring out full on Tuesday.
What an incisive and compelling panel, at least from my point of view. And now, as we wind this up, I want to introduce Mel Levine. Most of you are familiar with him. I've known him for more than 50 years, so that kind of dates both of us. He is a great public servant, longtime member of Congress, and a moving force now in the life of this community. Mel?
Bob, thank you let's see, am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of these superb panelists. We had planned to put an all-star panel together, and we did. And this all-star panel really delivered. We couldn't have asked for better as we head into the last 48 hours between now and the election. I have a couple of administrative closing announcements. I'll begin, though, by just reiterating what Zev had to say at the beginning. I'm confident that everybody in this audience has either voted or has a plan to vote. I would encourage you also to talk to any of the people that you know that you're friendly with in any of the battleground states and make sure that they are planning on voting as well. You've probably already done that too, but I would underscore its importance. Ordinarily, we have these panels and discussions on Wednesday evenings at 5 o'clock California time. We are not going to have one this coming Wednesday, November 4th, but we will resume our programming on the following Wednesday, November 11th at 5 o'clock California time with Bill Crystal, moderated by Pat Morrison. The program is entitled What Happened? A Thinking Conservatives Postmortem, which will without a doubt provide cogent analysis of the election results and or the status of the election at that time. And we'll continue each Wednesday in November to hear from extraordinary panelists that have graced our camera before. On the 18th, we will have Ron Brownstein. On the 25th, the incomparable George will return. And to start off our December, we will launch our December programming on December 2nd at 5 o'clock LA time with Congressman Adam Schiff, who, as you all know, is chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and who has spoken with us several times before to help us to understand the new Congress and talk to us about the new legislative agenda. And with that, I just want to thank this wonderful panel again and look forward to what hopefully will be a satisfying week ahead. And with that, we will close the program. Thank you.